way of the National Security Council to state, where she was in charge of what was called the Office of Oceans and International Environmental Scientific Affairs. Environmental and Scientific Affairs. Where she found herself at least knee-deep in the international negotiations that preceded the Kyoto meeting in 1997, including the rather famous Berlin meeting. And then she was actually made the right resignation, which she may or may not tell you about, when she left the government. Whereupon, the Pew Foundation, flexing its muscles and changing its character, decided it wanted an independent institute, not wholly owned by them, but out there, to deal with climate policy. And they asked her to run it, and she did for quite a few years. And one of its products was the Climate Action Plan, which was a negotiation among industry and NGO leaders that became the cornerstone, or more than the cornerstone, the backbone of the Waxman Markey bill. So there has been a lot happening wherever she was. She's talking today about, her title is, if I have it here, 1 second, it's probably right on the screen. No, it isn't on the screen, okay. It's a good title, so I want to find it for you. I thought I had it in front of me. The history of climate change policy, evolution, devolution, revolution. Not convolution. Okay.
I should have talked to you before, because that would actually have been just right. Well, thank you very much, and it's delightful to be here at Princeton, and I'm going to talk on a subject that has occupied, as Bob said, much of my time over the past 2 decades. Climate change policy, both globally and in the United States. You know, usually I try to begin a speech with a bit of humor. So I could talk about the permafrost, which is neither permanent nor frosty, or the rainforest, which may soon be neither rainy nor forested. But instead, since I'm going to talk about the history of climate change policy, I'd like to begin with a quote from the poet T.S. Eliot. "The only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless." So with that in mind, I'm going to suggest that we start our examination with how global climate policy evolved with the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. Ratified by 197 countries, this agreement went into effect in March 1994, and now, more than 2 decades later, its influence is still potent. The influence can be found in many strands, but 3 stand out: the Convention's ultimate goal, the nature and ambition of the commitments for individual countries or groups of countries in pursuit of that goal, and the distinction drawn between developed and developing countries. The goal of the 1992 Convention is to prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system, a goal that remained in place without additional elaboration for 17 years. It's only in 2009, in the Copenhagen Accord, and then again in the Cancun Agreement in 2010, that reference is made to the need to keep global temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius, which is 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, above pre-industrial levels. And in Paris, in December of last year, the 2-degree target is reaffirmed with a further statement that the parties to the agreement should, quote, drive efforts to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So what has evolved here is a better definition of what is needed to effectively address climate change, an elaboration of the convention while still keeping the goal intact. Unfortunately, we haven't found a path to achieving that goal. The convention itself sets no binding limits on greenhouse gas emissions. It establishes that developed countries should, quote, take the lead in addressing climate change. Developed countries as a group are also tasked with the aim, that's the word used, of stabilizing their greenhouse gas emissions at 1990 levels by the year 2000. Developing countries are treated very differently. Their actions, which are undefined, depend on whether developed countries meet their commitments on financial resources and technology transfer. The convention goes on to state that developing country actions must, in any event, take into account, and I'm going to quote here, that economic and social development and poverty eradication are the first and overriding priorities. By 1995, just after the convention went into effect, it was already clear that its goal was inadequate to prevent dangerous interference with the climate system, and that stricter controls were needed. A 2-year negotiation process ensued that resulted in the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. The protocol establishes legally binding targets for each developed country. For the United States, it was 7% below 1990 emission levels for the 2008 to 2012 period. But it continues the developing country divide with no targets for developing countries. The specific binding levels were internationally negotiated and range from 8% below 1990 levels for the European Union to 10% above 1990 levels for Iceland. Implementation was left to individual countries, although the agreement offered considerable flexibility in how those targets can be met. 192 countries ratified the protocol, but the United States, which at that time was the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, did not ratify it. In fact, the Clinton administration, knowing that it would result in failure, didn't even send the protocol to the Senate for its advice and consent. In large part because of the US failure to ratify, and in part due to the complexities of the agreement itself, the protocol did not enter into force until 2005, with the targets to take effect in the first 2008 to 2012 commitment period. Without the world's largest emitter, us, and without any targets that reflected the growing emissions from the major developing countries, Kyoto implementation stumbled and then collapsed. Canada withdrew in 2011. A second commitment period was agreed in Doha in 2012, with the EU and its 28 member states and 8 other countries accepting binding targets. In addition to the US and Canada, Japan, New Zealand, and Russia had no targets. 59 countries accepted the Doha Amendment, but 144 were needed for it to enter into force. Of the countries with binding targets, only 7 have ratified the amendment. But of course, it was obvious long before 2012 that the Kyoto Protocol was on life support. A serious attempt was made in 2009 in Copenhagen to reach an agreement that would expand and update Kyoto with binding emission limits for developed countries and a 2020 target date. But this effort did not succeed, in large part due to the inability of the United States to accept an agreement that would require the advice and consent of the Senate. Also at issue was the question of what should be asked or required of the major emitting developing countries, given their rapid economic and emissions growth. In Copenhagen, the United States argued that developing countries should also have commitments. But since neither the United States nor the developing countries would accept commitments that were legally binding, a political framework called the Copenhagen Accord emerged from the negotiations at the last minute. The Accord shifts away from a system with legally binding targets for some, as in Kyoto, to one where all commitments are voluntary. In this case, it returns to the framework of the 1992 Convention. But like the Kyoto Protocol, each country has its own unique target or action, although these targets were not internationally negotiated, but submitted by countries individually. The Accord still draws a distinction between developed and developing countries, but the distinction is based on the type of commitment. Developed countries have targets, developing countries specify the actions they will take. 16 developed countries submitted 2020 emission targets, 37 developing countries submitted mitigation actions. These characteristics found full voice in the 2015 Paris Agreement. Like the Copenhagen Accord, this hybrid agreement combines characteristics of both the Framework Convention and the Kyoto Protocol. Pledges called INDCs, or the way you come up with these names, intended nationally determined contributions, are voluntary, although both developed and developing countries have provided them. Developed country contributions are in the form of economy-wide reduction targets. Developing country contributions range from absolute economy-wide targets to reductions in per capita emissions. Financial and technical assistance are also not binding. There's no enforcement, and there are no penalties. Although reporting and updating of contributions, it's another funny word that they developed in this process, at regularly scheduled intervals are requirements with legal force. As of the date of the agreement, more than 180 countries had made pledges. Yet, even if all the pledges are met, and history suggests this may not be the case, the 2-degree goal is not on the horizon, let alone 1.5 degrees. Combining the pledges and assuming they are met results in a roughly 3-degree temperature rise over pre-industrial levels. Some have called the Paris Agreement a tale of lessons learned. Certainly, the failures of Kyoto and Copenhagen strongly suggest that an agreement with binding targets by all the major emitters was not possible. The United States, with its inability to secure the advice and consent of the Senate, and China, with its unwillingness to commit to any legally binding regime, particularly without the United States, would have precluded such a deal. But this agreement did bring together the world community, as it did in Rio, but failed to do in Kyoto. At best, it can be seen as a step on a very long road to stabilization of the climate. Looking back on the 23-year history of international climate policy, it's easy to be cynical about its slow evolution, about the failure of the international system to effectively deal with a truly serious problem. It's also useful to look at the history as a history of devolution, from global policy to national policy to subnational policy. Because just as we've seen shifts from commitments that are voluntary to mandatory and then back to voluntary, we've also seen a shift from internationally agreed commitments to national pledges. And in the United States, this shift continues to the state level. International negotiations with the participation of 190 countries are difficult at best, and let me assure you that they are difficult. But in the case of an issue like climate change, reaching agreement in which every country believes it has achieved a win is especially complex. The reality is that climate change is an issue that is driven by national economic conditions and priorities, and therefore by national politics. For this reason alone, it's easy to see why individual nations would want to set their own targets or commitments and would not want to negotiate those commitments with other nations. It took 23 years for the international negotiating process to formally recognize this in the Paris Agreement. If individual nations are fully responsible for both setting and achieving the commitments that they make, do they do so by establishing and executing national programs, or is there a further devolution to the subnational level? Climate policy in the United States paralleled global climate policy with its emphasis on voluntary programs designed at the federal level in the post-Rio, pre-Kyoto period. But as the international negotiations leading up to the Kyoto Protocol progressed, so did the debate on climate change and climate change policy in the United States. While the United States government participated in and even could be seen as the primary architect of the Kyoto Protocol, opposition to any mandatory international agreement on climate change grew steadily, culminating in the passage of the Byrd-Hagel resolution in the Senate in July of 1997. The vote was 95-0. The resolution urged the president, first, not to sign any agreement that mandated greenhouse gas reductions for developed countries unless there were specific developing country commitments in the same compliance period. And second, not to sign any agreement that would result in serious harm to the US economy. This is the issue over which I resigned. The administration did move forward with the Kyoto negotiations and did sign the Kyoto Protocol, even though it contained no specific developing country commitments. But as I said before, it never sent the agreement to the Senate for its advice and consent, and the United States never became a party to the protocol. By 2000, interest in national action on climate change emerged in the US Senate. Republican Senator John McCain and then Democratic Senator Joe Lieberman introduced climate change cap-and-trade legislation in the Senate in 2001, in 2003, and in 2005. It didn't come to a vote in 2001. In 2003, it was defeated 55-43, which actually is not bad for the first time something is being considered in the Senate. In 2005, it was defeated 60-38. But it ushered in a short-lived period of bipartisan action to address climate change. In the 110th Congress, that's 2007-2008, 5 bills were introduced in the Senate and 5 in the House. None of these bills came to a vote, but it's worth noting that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama co-sponsored the McCain bill, even though all 3 were battling for the presidency. Also of note is the fact that 12 Republican senators went on record favoring mandatory curbs on greenhouse gas emissions. Meanwhile, in 2006, a group of businesses and NGOs formed a coalition called the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, and my organization and I were a major part of that. And in January of 2009, issued a blueprint for national cap-and-trade legislation. The blueprint became the basis for the Waxman-Markey bill, a climate change cap-and-trade bill that passed the House in June 2009 by a vote of 219 to 212, with 8 Republican votes. The bill moved on to the Senate, where for a variety of reasons, including increased partisanship in the Congress, a lack of concrete support from the Obama administration, general exhaustion after the passage of the stimulus, financial reforms, and the Affordable Care Act, it never came to a vote. Yet it was on the strength of the House vote that the Obama administration pledged a reduction of 17% below 2005 levels of greenhouse gases by 2020 in Copenhagen. After Copenhagen and the collapse of the effort to enact national climate legislation, the Obama administration began a serious process to use its existing authorities to reduce greenhouse gases. In its pledge as part of the Paris Agreement, the United States said it intends to achieve a 26 to 28% reduction from 2005 levels of greenhouse gases by 2025. It hopes to meet this target with a combination of national regulatory measures, some of which will be implemented nationally and others by the states. The centerpiece of the submission is the Clean Power Plan, a program that is estimated to reduce U.S. emissions by just over 7% below 2005 levels by 2025. The program sets individual state targets, but allows states great flexibility in how the targets are to be met. The rule, issued by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in final form in 2015, was immediately challenged in court by 27 states and a number of industry groups. Meanwhile, 18 states issued a brief supporting the rule, but both its survival and its schedule for implementation are up in the air. The Supreme Court ruled in February that the rule should neither be implemented nor enforced until the High Court itself has heard the case presented by the rule's opponents. The Court of Appeals will hear the case in June and in all likelihood issue an opinion in early 2017. This opinion will almost certainly be appealed, and the Supreme Court will then have its say. In the original rule, states were to submit their plans for meeting their targets by 2018 at the latest, but because of the actions by the court, the state will almost certainly be pushed back. Exactly what this means is a little unclear. 16 states are continuing to plan for implementation of the rule. 12 states have suspended all planning efforts, and 14 states have either made no announcement or have indicated that they are reviewing their options. So while it is clear that the ability of the U.S. to meet the 7% goal from this particular rule by 2025 will be affected, by how much is anyone's guess at the moment. Other national programs pursued by the administration do not rely on the states. These include measures to reduce hydrofluorocarbons, resulting in a 3.5% to 7% reduction, and the heavy-duty truck rules, resulting in approximately a 1% reduction. But even if all 3 of these efforts are successful, and taking into account the reductions that have already occurred as a result of switching from coal to gas in the electricity sector, increased use of renewable energy, improved vehicle efficiency, and no growth in electricity demand, the reductions from 2005 levels will range from 16 to 20% by 2025. How then will the United States meet the target it put forward in Paris of a 26 to 28% reduction? Some of this gap could be filled with improved energy efficiency, land use changes, and fuel switching in the industrial sector. But given that the chance of major additional actions at the federal level are small because of a polarized Congress and the need to rely on executive orders and existing authority, reliance on the states will only continue to grow. So how have the states performed to date? The states were particularly active during the period between the Kyoto Protocol, 1997, and the Copenhagen Accord, 2009. Many saw the US failure to ratify the protocol, coupled with a policy of doing little at the federal level, as both an opportunity and, in some cases, an obligation to move forward at the state level. 18 states have greenhouse gas reduction targets, although they vary on base years, 1990 to 2006, and ultimate dates, 2020 to 2050. For example, New York has a target of an 80% reduction below 1990 levels by 2050. California's target is to reach 1990 levels by 2020. But it's important to note that many of these targets were established by executive order of the governor, and as many of the governors that established these goals are no longer in office, there is some question about how they'll be implemented. Also important to note is the fact that 10 states account for nearly 50% of all US greenhouse gas emissions. Of these, only 4 have targets, and only in 1, California, has the governor been succeeded by a governor with a strong commitment to addressing climate change. I'm sorry if this is depressing. More important has been the effort states have put into shifting toward cleaner energy. 28 states plus the District of Columbia have renewable portfolio standards that require that a certain percentage of electricity used by the state come from renewable sources. A number of these states have already met their requirement and are considering increasing the standard. Several states have seen challenges to their standards, and a few have frozen their programs. But there is no question that these requirements, particularly when coupled with tax credits for renewables enacted at the federal level, have been successful in lowering the cost of wind and solar and spurring their growth. Are there likely to be increased state effort to fill the gap between the US pledge and actions at the state and federal level? Well, anything is possible, and I'm not particularly good at predicting the future. But I think the odds are slim that the target will be met. So what can we conclude about global and national policy efforts to address climate change? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, issued its first assessment in 1990, initiating a process that led to the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. In the 25 years since that assessment, and even though the science has become clearer and clearer on both the causes and impacts of climate change, global CO2 emissions have increased by approximately 50%. The International Energy Agency, in its central climate case, sees energy-related CO2 emissions continuing to grow, although far more slowly. They predict that emissions would be 16% higher in 2040 than in 2013. Of course, some argue that absent international and national efforts and policies, emissions would be higher, and that is almost certainly true. Others argue that complex issues often take decades before they are resolved, and there's a lot of evidence for that. But I think no one can argue that our climate change policy has been a success. Humility should be the order of the day. Still, as we look forward, we need to look beyond purely government policy solutions. The reality is that meaningful global agreements are increasingly hard to come by, and national actions in the United States and elsewhere are often stymied by dysfunctional governments that often have neither the will nor the means to act comprehensively and decisively. A broader look does give some reasons for cautious optimism. Increasingly, targeted citizen activism has begun to influence the actions of governments at all levels. And perhaps more importantly, advances in technology have begun to have a real impact on our greenhouse gas emissions. If we look at citizen activism, there are 2 campaigns that stand out: the effort to oppose construction of the Keystone Pipeline and the Beyond Coal campaign. In November of 2015, President Obama announced that after a 7-year review process, he would reject the request to build the Keystone Pipeline. He cited climate change as his reason for the denial and indicated that the pipeline had occupied what he called, quote, an overinflated role in our political discourse. In fact, the entire pipeline issue was largely symbolic, with exaggerated claims from the proponents of the pipeline saying it would be a boon for the economy, and opponents saying it would be a climate disaster. The reality is that if there is sufficient demand for oil from the Canadian tar sands, it will find its way into the United States, if not by pipeline, then by rail. But the environmental community, a key constituency of the Obama administration, made rejection of the pipeline a major focus, with marches and rallies in front of the White House and across the country. So while the environmental benefits are small at best, there is no question that citizen action influenced the final outcome. Then let's look at the Beyond Coal campaign. This campaign has targeted coal-fired power plants, the largest single source of carbon emissions in the United States. Led by the Sierra Club, with ample funding from Bloomberg Philanthropies, the campaign follows two strategies. It works at the grassroots level to build opposition to both new and existing plants, with traditional air pollution and not in my backyard arguments. But more important, it works through the state regulatory process by making the argument that shutting down these plants will actually save money. In this effort, it has not been fighting alone. The price of renewable energy and natural gas have come down dramatically at the same time as the price of coal has increased, due in large part to traditional air pollution regulations that have targeted coal-fired power plants. Significant users of electricity in the business community are therefore also allies as they search for lower electricity prices. The result of this campaign, combined with policy and regulatory efforts from EPA and fuel price reductions for alternative energy sources, have led to dramatic changes in the electricity system of the United States. Coal supplied 50% of US electricity in 2005. It supplied just 34% in 2015. In November of 2015, coal's share had fallen to 29%. Again, while the work of activists cannot be credited with the transformation of the energy system, it's clearly played an important role in this ongoing transition. If activism on the environment provides one glimmer of hope, the advance of technology clearly provides another. The steady improvement in and declining cost of low-carbon technologies is expected to continue over the next decade, transforming our electricity system. According to the International Energy Agency, renewables will overtake coal as the largest source of electricity by the early 2030s, and will be approximately 50% of generation in the European Union, and 30% in China and Japan, and above 25% in the US and India by that time. But for the world to be on a path to 2 degrees or less, far more will be needed. There are 3 particular areas which need to be vigorously pursued. First, although coal burning is in decline in many parts of the world, plants that burn coal are still being built. The World Coal Association reports that 510 coal-fired power plants are under construction, with more than 1,800 in the planning stages. Of those in the planning stages, more than 450 are in India and more than 350 in China. A coal-fired plant has a useful life of greater than 40 years, and there is not much chance that governments and companies will write off these investments. The only chance we have to contain their negative impact is through carbon capture and storage or reuse, or some other technology that prevents the carbon dioxide from being emitted into the atmosphere. We'll also need a similar technology to deal with emissions from gas-fired plants, as many are being built in many different parts of the world. If government policy neither requires nor provides incentives to employ these technologies, there is little chance that they will be used, and little chance of restraining climate change. Government action to deploy this technology is a must, but it's interesting to note that when governments made their pledges in Paris, carbon capture and storage and reuse was not a topic of discussion at all. A second technological must-do involves nuclear power. It's hard to imagine that we can contain climate change without retaining and perhaps expanding the use of nuclear power. Newer, safer technologies will be needed here, including methods of waste disposal. But again, investment in such improvements will only take place if there is a policy framework in place that emphasizes the need to deploy low carbon or carbon-free technologies. And again, discussion of nuclear energy was not highlighted in the Paris pledges, even though many countries, particularly in Asia, are actually building a lot of nuclear power plants. There's also still much work to be done to expand the use of renewables, particularly in the areas of transmission and storage. Great strides have been made in the ability to predict when power will be needed, thus enabling more efficient operations and greater use of wind and solar. And battery storage has also shown significant improvement. Growth in the deployment of renewables has been substantial, even in a world where fossil fuel prices have been low. But again, the 2-degree target, or even a 3-degree target, will remain elusive if we don't see technology improvements that will enable even greater deployment of renewable energy resources. While government investment in research and development in the energy sector has not reflected the urgent need for transformative technologies, the recent creation of the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, a public-private partnership between governments, research institutions, and investors to transform the energy sector, is an important development. Spearheaded by Bill Gates, the coalition recognizes both the importance and urgency of new technology development and deployment. Its goal is to develop an energy system that is, quote, reliable, affordable, and does not produce carbon. In other words, a revolution. So there we have it. 25 years of evolution, devolution, and the early stages of a revolution. We've articulated the goal and refined it. We've tried many different avenues to achieve it, and we're still not on a path to get us there. So please forgive me, but I studied English literature in college and graduate school, and I am reminded again of another quote from the poet T.S. Eliot. "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Understanding where we are and where we must go is crucial. And quite honestly, our understanding has improved by leaps and bounds, but it must be translated into action. Certainly, we need policy, we need technology, we need citizen engagement, and we need to make clear to politicians that their fortunes are tied directly to their efforts in limiting climate change and the damage it may cause. Is this possible? Maybe. Whether we achieve it or not is up to all of us. Thank you.
Quite a bit of time for questions. And, start with that group. I think we'll talk to is there anybody in there?
Would you care to comment on the problem of methane leakage off of natural gas production and transport in relation to CO2?
Yeah, big problem. I mean, CO2 takes longer, methane is faster. We actually have the technologies to deal with it. There's no question that we should do it, and we should do it sooner rather than later. I mean, there is a piece where we know that there's a problem, we know how to fix it, so, I mean, let's get on with it and do it. And, I mean, there is rulemaking and sort of, I think it's in process, I'm not sure exactly where it is in the government, using existing authorities so they can do it, and I think they will do it.
But it has to be more than the United States. There's a lot of...
It has to be more than the United States, yes.
Well,
In naming the problem, which was a somewhat analysis of the failure of the 2009 cap and trade bill that passed the Senate,
House.
one of the main conclusions was something that you just said, which it's going to take citizens to force their legislators to take action.
Yeah.
And I invite everybody here to join Citizens Climate Lobby, and that is our single focus, is to pass national climate legislation. If you haven't heard of us, you should. Go to the web, look us up, join a group.
I mean, honestly, I think that is the right thing to do, but as I look at the Congress and imagine what it might look like in a year, 2 years, 4 years, I think it's going to be really hard even if you have a president who really wants to do something, to actually get legislation passed. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but it's really tough, so you have a challenge.
Yes, I had a professor down at Rutgers tell me that it would be 2022 before the Congress would be in shape to pass national climate legislation.
That's pretty
And
optimistic.
anybody in this room that thinks we gotta wait that long
Yeah.
is destroying the future for their kids.
Okay, other question? Or comment? Yes.
Can you kind of break down what the arguments of the opponents to climate change legislation is? And assuming a lot of it is, economic, has there been any analysis done to what the impact to the economy would be on actually all of the sort of ideal climate change?
Yes. I mean, first you have a group in the Congress that says it doesn't exist, it's a hoax, right? Then you have a group who said, all right, there's some climate change, but it has nothing to do with us, so we shouldn't take any responsibility for it. So, I mean, quite honestly, that group was relatively small, and it has grown as the politics have changed. So it makes it very difficult. Now, there's also a group who says, I hate government regulation. I don't want government regulation in my life. I mean, I might want it for certain issues, but not for something like this. And so that sort of libertarian strain is there, which says, well, okay, even if it's a problem, I don't want the government to do anything about it and tell me what to do, or tell me I shouldn't have a large SUV, I should have that kind of an argument. There's been a lot of stuff done on the economics of, let's say, a national cap and trade bill or any other kind of bill. And I think in the long term, they all suggest that there are not huge negative impacts. But in the short term, because you're changing things, it's disruptive. And there are impacts that will affect people. I mentioned this to some other, I can't remember which class it was, because I've been to a lot of them, but I can recall testifying on climate change legislation, and a congressman from a particular district in Illinois where they have a lot of coal held up a picture of 3 miners with hard hats and blackened faces and said, can you tell me that these 3 miners will still have their jobs after we do what you're proposing we do? We also are not a country with a great safety net, so there will be disruptions and there will be people that are affected, and we could, if we wanted to, sort of help them, but well, it's almost a bridge too far, I think, in the current climate.
If you want to answer,
Sorry, you've asked already.
I'm not asking, I'm answering the question that was asked, and she was asking about the economic impacts. If she reads the column by Edward Porter, Economic Scene in New York Times Wednesday column, she'll find out a lot about the economics of dealing with it.
Thank you. Yes.
Is there enough funding going to the actual technology piece and the research and all that? I visited UMass, just the engineering part for my daughter recently, and we talked to a professor, and he said there's no funding that he can get for it.
I mean, there is a fair amount of research. I mean, if you look at government investment, however, in energy research, it's relatively small compared to research in other areas, and it should be much greater, which I think is why you have things like this Bill Gates coalition with a bunch of investors saying they're going to put in a fair amount of money into this because it's really important to do it. So I don't know, Bob, you actually might have a better answer for this.
Okay, for now. Question here.
I want to ask a little about what you imagine about technology diffusion. If technology is really the centerpiece of solving this issue, like how are you going to help? What is the framework, or what is the path do you imagine of diffusing this technology across countries, especially between developed and developing countries?
I mean, I think the most important thing is to make sure that the price is really low and really competitive with dirtier technologies. And we've seen that. I mean, the price of solar has come down dramatically. The price of wind is pretty cheap. Now, it depends a little bit on where you are, and it's not uniform across the US or the globe. But the more it is diffused and deployed, the cheaper it will become. And I think that's what people are counting on, because, I mean, if you look in the United States at how the states regulate energy, The public utility commissions are really looking at price. That's their big issue, keeping the price low for the consumer. And a lot of them are now saying, well, gee, I mean, we actually could do some of the renewables because they're cheaper than coal. So, I mean, I think that's one of the best ways to proceed, is to make sure the price gets lower and lower, and therefore it will be adopted more and more.
I have a question about devolution. As you say, more and more of the responsibility is being taken on by smaller and smaller entities. But then you have these instances of, say, for instance, Denton, Texas, that banned fracking within its city limits and immediately got sued.
Right.
Where do you see that going?
Yeah, well, I mean, on this issue, the current group of state legislatures are really a problem because they are trying in many cases to sort of undo some of the good things that have been done at that level. But if the federal government has its hands tied, which I think it does, and if the Congress is not going to do something at the national level, you really are left with having to go to the state level and even the local level. And for example, there are lots of cities that are doing lots of things. I mean, most of them are energy efficiency and things that are easy to do that help their bottom line. I mean, they're moving in that direction. That's not enough, but it's really good. I think in the US, the states have a major role to play, and it's sort of interesting that you've got this divide in the states. It used to be that you would have a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature, or the reverse. And they actually had to get along and had to work things out and had to make compromises in order to move forward. Now, more and more, you have sort of single party control at the state level, which is maybe good for this issue in some cases and terrible for this issue in other places. But I mean, that's just sort of the reality of the politics. So yeah, there are states that will force cities and counties not to do the right thing at the moment.
In World War II, has anyone plumbed the depths of how the rapid transformations were done in World War, leading up to World War II? I guess there was the businesses were, I believe Roosevelt made sure that the businesses would make profits on the rapid change, and also there was a lot of propaganda films. I'm sort of stunned that there hasn't been any good, with all our technology and for film technology, there hasn't been any good actually impressing upon people the images of what we're in for. So it just seems like we haven't really used some of the important tools of visualization and making sure people make profits,
Right.
So they aren't fighting against this.
Right. Well, I mean, two parts to that. I mean, the environmental community has done a certain amount in this area, but my sense is that much, I said some, but much of that, I think, is directed at those who are already driven on this issue, and it doesn't really expand the base of people that care about it. So we do need a much better way to communicate to a much broader audience, and maybe we need different messengers who can carry that message to different kinds of audiences.
Anyone want to pick up on that? Anyone from Climate Central? Our local organization that is very much thinking about reaching larger groups,
Yep.
not just the converted.
On the issue of making money, I mean, there are companies who are pretty serious about this, and there are companies with their own internal targets, and some of those companies are the companies we work. I mean, I have a long history of trying to work with what I would call the more progressive companies on this issue, and there are some. And I think it was Jeff Immelt from GE who said green is green, and actually GE has done very well with some of their greener programs and greener technologies. So there is interest. There are companies who are looking ahead and who are seeing a market. Some of them are thinking that the market in the US is not so great because we have this sort of dysfunctional system, and they're looking abroad where there might be a greater appetite for some of this. But honestly, except for the companies who absolutely view themselves as losers, which would be like the coal companies and companies like that, I think the companies are less of a problem than the sort of ideologues who are politicians.
Any other questions? Okay.
I just want to make a comment in regards to selection. New Jersey is a deregulated state.
Right.
And it shocks me that a lot of people don't know that, one, and two, when given the option of selecting a greener supplier, they
Don't choose it,
refuse
yeah.
because they don't want to mess around with PSE&G, even though PSE&G will go out and just get whatever energy is cheaper. from
Right,
the
yeah, absolutely.
distributor.
Yeah, that unfortunately is true.
Have I missed any hand? Trying to look around. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about some of the legal issues about climate change? It seems like we have the Attorney General in New York going after Exxon right now on a very slim issue. But there's also this new idea of attribution coming. Are people and companies worried about it? And are policymakers worried about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think companies are definitely worried about it. I mean, you try to think about the motivation of a big emitter company and why they would be so forthcoming on climate change and why they would lobby for climate change legislation, and many of them did at CEO level, so serious business. And I think some of it is fear of liability. I mean, some of it is the other argument, which is, green is green and we can do this. Some of it is something is going to happen here, and I'd rather be on the side of those who could help shape it rather than just sort of have it imposed upon me. So there are a variety of different things. And yeah, I think everyone is looking at the legal angles, particularly since new legislation is not on the horizon.